What is the Buffalo Bills fantasy football outlook in 2022? We're talking to fantasy football expert Jaime Eisner today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino from the Draft Network, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Today on the podcast, we are going to break down this Buffalo Bills football team through the lens of fantasy football. And folks, I am not great at fantasy football, and so I had to bring on my guy, Jaime Eisner, also from the Draft Network. He's our COO, and he does a lot of fantasy football content. He's been doing projections for years. We've had him on the show a few times, right, in recent years, talking Bills and fantasy football, and he's going to give us the non-homer takes as it relates to the Bills and their outlook when it comes to fantasy football in 2022. Jaime, thanks for joining me.
Happy to be here. I guess it's like my biannual appearance here on Locked On Bills, and I don't know if your listeners and viewers have seen you wear the Draft Good Players hat, but even though it's mirrored right now if you're watching us, but it just doesn't apply to the NFL draft. It applies to fantasy drafts as well.
Well, the Bills have some good players, right? We have a good story to talk about today. And I guess we'll start with the big one, the most obvious guy, Josh Allen at quarterback. There's going to be some more interesting conversations to have about guys like Gabriel Davis. I'm interested in your thoughts on Jamison Crowder and Dawson Knox and, how he's going to stack 2022 on top of what he did last year. But I'm going to start with Josh Allen, the Bills starting quarterback. Is this QB1? Can you see in terms of fantasy, is he your QB1? And is the gap big if he is your QB1? Can you make a case for other guys?
So he is my QB1. I wouldn't say the gap is huge, but I also wouldn't say I could really make a strong case for anybody else to be QB1. And look, I know the guy who won at the beginning of the year or the player that finished as QB1 the last year, just history tells us is not likely to finish in that number one overall spot again. But I can't really make a compelling argument for anybody else. My projections have him getting almost 2 full fantasy points per game, more than any other fantasy quarterback this year. I like the weapons that he has. He obviously has the rushing upside, and particularly the rushing touchdown upside that you really love. Those 6-point touchdowns are tremendous in fantasy right now. And I really can't make an argument that he shouldn't be the first quarterback off the board. Now, the question is where do you draft him? Because I never usually in a single quarterback league like to take a quarterback early. Because if you're in a 12-team league, single quarterback, you can find good passers later. So I usually don't like missing up on opportunities to take a quarterback in the 3rd round. But I can't make a compelling argument for you to take any other quarterback right now. And if I'm asked who's going to be the number one QB in fantasy, the answer is only Josh Allen right now, which I'm sure is music to everybody's ears. But what is there not to like?
Well, Jaime, you're talking to Bills Mafia right now. That's your audience. And I'm guessing they're going to want to have Josh Allen on their fantasy football team. They're going to want to pick him in the 1st round, in redraft leagues. Is it smart to wait? Or if you want this guy, you got to pull the trigger?
Well, if you're in a super flex league, so where you're playing 2 quarterbacks, you're absolutely taking Josh Allen in the 1st round. And there's honestly even an argument to take him with the 1st overall pick in that scenario. So if you are playing in that format, pull the trigger the second you get that opportunity. But if you're playing in a single quarterback league, you're probably better off waiting a little bit. I'm taking a look right now to give you the very up-to-date on the people that are drafting super early. The ADP average right now is 22.7. So that's the end of the 2nd round. I'm not taking any quarterback there, just to be perfectly frank with everybody. But once you get into the 3rd round-ish, I think you can make that argument. But I don't think it's going to sink. Taking Josh Allen's not going to sink your team. He's going to be a high volume performer. The difference is kind of the drop off at running back and wide receiver compared to what you would get in the later rounds is a lot greater than the drop off at quarterback. But I will say this, if you're going to take a quarterback here, I do feel pretty strongly about Josh Allen. Because for me, if I'm just looking at my projections right now, which you can see under the fantasy tab at thedraftnetwork.com, there's my cheap plug. The difference between him and QB 12, for example, is about 6 fantasy points per game. So I don't want to pretend like there's no difference there, but I would be cautious drafting him in the second round. But if he gets to round 3, I think you could take it. And if you're in a Bills only league, like if you're in a league with a bunch of like Bills fans, you always have to kind of know what your league mates are going to do. You're going to have to take him in the second round. And that might change things a little bit. But if you're doing just a random draft with people that are out there, or you're in a money league, I would see if you can wait to the third round to take Josh Allen. But there is no other QB I would take at the top spot.
Last question about Josh Allen really stems from how is the fantasy community responding to 2 things. The first one being that this is a new offensive coordinator. I know that Ken Dorsey was the quarterback's coach for 3 years. There's a lot of carryover, but it is a new offensive coordinator, a new play caller. There's some level of adjustment we should expect. And then number 2, just the fact that for as good as Josh Allen was last year and the year before, he had some clunkers, right? I mean, he had 6 games where he had a sub 80 passer rating. And I know that passer rating doesn't really speak to fantasy numbers, and there's always those redeeming rushing yards that you get from Josh Allen. But is there some level of concern over just some of those low lights from last year, even against some poor teams, and also just with the new offensive coordinator?
Really none that I've heard, actually. It's been pretty positive, and I think some of that is kind of some concern for the other quarterbacks that are around him. Like, and I think we talk about quarterbacks that have been in that competition to be in that number 1 spot alongside him in recent years. You talk about Patrick Mahomes would be the first name that comes to mind. And I think there's a lot more worry about what a post-Tyreek Hill Kansas City offense looks like. Lamar Jackson's coming off of a down year for his standards and coming off of injuries. Kyler Murray, who I think the community is too low on, who's actually my QB2, people are really fading him because of the way the Cardinals played in the back half of the year, and then the DeAndre Hopkins suspension. So I think because of a lot of the question marks at some of those other quarterbacks there, that really Josh Allen hasn't even been considered there. I mean, they're taking him really only a couple spots lower than in overall ADP right now than where people were taking Mahomes after that MVP year. So, I mean, there doesn't seem to be a lot of concern in the fantasy community about Josh Allen not being the top guy.
Now, something I'm sure there is plenty of concern regarding the Bills and the fantasy community is the running back situation, where it's probably not been very fun for people who have drafted Bills running backs and expected, well, hey, this is a really good offense, let's get their running back. It's probably not produced like you may have hoped. And there's some interesting dynamics this year for the Bills at running back. First of all, Devin Singletary, who was a really good player towards the end of the last season, really kind of taking over as the lead back, which is something we hadn't seen in Buffalo. And I guess I'm interested are you treating that as an outlier? Do you think the back stretch of Devin Singletary is the norm moving forward? And then, of course, there's this new addition, James Cook, 2nd round pick, the pass catcher. And for as exciting as that skill set is, the Bills have not gotten the running backs going out of the backfield as pass catchers under Josh Allen, and the screen game really hasn't been a thing. And, they've had players like Matt Breida, TJ Yeldon, pass catching specialists, if you will, and neither of those players really manifested themselves. Now, we're talking about a 2nd round pick in James Cook with a really intriguing skill set. But how are you looking at Devin Singletary and considering what he did late last year, and then now this new layer of James Cook?
Yeah, they're both very intriguing, and neither of them makes it into my top 25 because I think they're going to cannibalize each other's production a little bit. But I do think it's worthy calling out Devin Singletary because I still have him ranked about 11 spots higher in my rankings right now. I have him at RB 30 and James Cook at RB 41 in half PPR. I know we always get excited about the new shiny toy when it's a rookie running back, who I do like, by the way. We'll get into him in a second. But I do think we saw enough flashes from Devin Singletary late last year that at least intrigue me enough. He's still going to get a lot of the early down work. He's still more polished at the moment on 1st and 2nd down than I think James Cook will be. And there's a little bit less of a projection with him. We kind of know how he's going to be used. We kind of know what his skill set's going to be. We kind of know that he doesn't have a super high peak, but he's got a decent floor. Where James Cook is I'm intrigued because you look at the sequence of events. You look at the idea of one, they did actually target Singletary in the passing game a little bit more finally late in the year. So you hope that's something that maybe carries over. They tried to sign J.D. McKissick. So in my mind, there is a role that the coaching staff has in mind that they haven't used before. But it's a projection from us. We haven't seen it. We don't know what it's going to be. We don't know how frequent it's going to be. And by the way, we don't know if things break down or if it doesn't work right away, if the Bills just go back to what has proven to be a very successful offense for them over these last couple of years. But I do think James Cook is going to have a role in this offense, a role in that pass catching, scenario for them on third downs. But I think we have to temper expectations for year one and look at him as more like a potential flex option than somebody that you're going to grab and want to start right away. I think both him and Singletary are flex options for me right now. But I would not shy away from either one, and particularly Singletary, who probably everybody's kind of forgetting about how strong he was in the fantasy space going into the playoffs and in the championship run last year. I think they both have some fantasy value this year, but as you said, it's been a tough go to kind of find value in that Bills backfield these last couple of years. And part of it's because we've never sure what combination, is Zach Moss going to be a thing? Was Matt Breida going to be a thing? I think we feel pretty confident that Singletary and Cook right now will be the only two running backs in the Buffalo backfield that have fantasy relevance this year. But with Cook, it's just still going to be a lot of projection, even though I like his skill set for the quote unquote JD McKissick role. Mm-hmm. I just don't know what JD McKissick role, quote unquote, looks like in Buffalo's offense. I think that's the disconnect there. I don't know how that's going to look. I don't think anybody knows outside of that building what that's going to look like yet. But I'm at least willing to take a chance because, missing out on a guy like that tells me they're trying to get something involved, and it would be a nice new element for that Bills offense. You don't have that slot safety blanket that you had before. But to me, the question is going to be, we've seen targets correlate more between tight ends and running backs than wide receivers and running backs. So I would caution the thought that, because Cole Beasley is gone, there's going to be more check down opportunities in the backfield. That doesn't necessarily, history says that doesn't really play out as simply as that. Typically, those targets will go elsewhere to other wide receivers more than they go to the backfield.
So let's just say you come away with one of the top running backs. Maybe it's Jonathan Taylor or Najee Harris, whoever the backs are that people want to get this year. If your RB2 is Devin Singletary, is that good enough, or is that more of a guy you'd like to have as that third player?
I would rather have him as a third guy, but it kind of depends on what you do in the middle there. Because if you're going to go wide receiver heavy and you're going to get some top guys at that position, you're going to have to sacrifice somewhere. And in that case, you're sacrificing the RB2 spot. I don't think it's a disaster because he's my RB30, but I don't think that you go in with that as your plan.
Yeah.
But you never know. The draft can be really weird. You might end up finding yourself in a spot where you take an elite running back and then maybe one of those elite tight ends fall to you in round 2. And you're in a spot where, I didn't expect to take a tight end there, but I'm not going to let Kelsey or Andrews fall past me. So I'm going to take them. And then you're going to lose out somewhere else because you're gaining an advantage on your opponents in one of the other spots. So it's not a disaster. But I don't think this is a scenario where you need to get both. If you do get both, that's fine. I'm not going into a draft targeting both. I don't think you need to grab, if you grab Singletary, you don't need to have Cook. If you have Cook, you don't need to have Singletary. I don't think this is a classic top running back handcuffed scenario. If it works out that way with ADP and the way you're drafting, great, but I wouldn't target that going in.
I know that you're big on betting odds, and one of the betting odds that stood out to me so far this year is the NFL Offensive Rookie of the Year, where James Cook, the last I checked, had the 5th best odds. Is that just because we don't expect a lot of quarterbacks to play as rookies? I'm excited about James Cook. I think he can catch 40 or 50 passes, something like that. But really 5th with some of the receivers out there?
Yeah, I wonder if that's just because of how excited Bills Mafia has been and is about their team. But
driving some money, I see.
Yeah, look, a lot of this stuff is the books are protecting themselves. First and foremost, they're trying to make money more than they're trying to be right. And I think you always have to kind of remember that in this process. But I agree with you. This is because there isn't this clear quarterback option. Like this, the Offensive Rookie of the Year award is a QB winner first, and then secondary position second. So in this case, it's like we don't know when any of these rookies are going to start. Is Pickett going to start week 1? Are any of the rookies going to start at all? So it kind of opens the door here. And I get the idea of this is an exciting player on a Super Bowl caliber team, going to get a lot of attention. So I kind of get that. I just don't think he's going to see the sort of volume, even if Singletary goes down. I'm not sure he's going to see the sort of volume to beat out some of these top wide receivers that are coming out that, a guy like Drake London or, if Treylon Burks ever gets his issues together, that are just going to be the top options for their team. And they're just going to get so many targets peppered their way. This is kind of a volume stat more than it is going to be an MVP value to your team stat. And I'm just not sure Cook is going to kind of get that sort of level of work when you're going to see triple-digit targets likely for a guy like Drake London in Atlanta. I just can't see that happening where Cook's going to get enough work to really be in that finals conversation come at the end of the year.
And score enough touchdowns, right? That's going to kind of be the big thing where we know Josh Allen's going to get a lot of those opportunities close to the goal. That's exactly right. So that's a challenging layer when you're considering the Bills and running backs and that type of stuff. Let's move over to the tight end position where Dawson Knox had a great season last year, led or tied for the league lead in receiving touchdowns among tight ends, and that came with him breaking his hand in the middle of the season and missing some time. Contract year for Dawson Knox, assuming nothing gets done this summer, and you see these tight ends are getting paid more and more every day. I mean, look at what David Njoku just got. The guy had like 450 yards receiving, and he gets this big deal. Your thoughts on Dawson Knox after what he showed last year with, O.J. Howard, now a very meaningful backup tight end in the mix as well?
Yeah, I think I'm probably lower on Knox than I wanted to be. And for me, I'm trying to project where the workload in this Bills offense is going to go. And yeah, O.J. Howard's there, but it would be unfair for me to say that I'm knocking Knox. That's a pun there. Knocking Knox too much for O.J. Howard. I think to me, it's more what we just talked about earlier. As we talk about where targets could shift in this offense, if I'm projecting Josh Allen to throw to running backs a little bit more often, odds are I'm taking a little bit of that target share away from Dawson Knox, at least in the middle of the field. He's still going to be a big red zone threat for them. I think he's still going to be involved. But I really like some of the other pieces that the Bills have on their roster, and I'm not as convinced that in the workload he's going to get. So that's he's one of those players where I'm probably, I wouldn't say I'm willing to be wrong on. Where it's just like he's not going to be a guy that I'm drafting a lot of because I kind of like the other pieces around. Like we'll talk about Diggs and Gabriel Davis, but I'm a big Jamison Crowder fan. I love what he brings to the table and the way Isaiah McKenzie can be used. And maybe we're going to get a little bit more work from both Singletary and Cook out of the backfield. I started to kind of lose amount of target share somewhere in the offense. And for me, I think there's a better chance that in the middle of the field that the Dawson Knox might be the guy that's the odd man out in this offense if it changes up a little bit. But if you want to take a shot on him, I wouldn't complain. And for me, if I'm not going to get one of these elite options, if I'm not getting the Kelce's, the Mark Andrews, the Kyle Pitts, Darren Waller, Kittles of the world, I'm probably going to sit back and wait. I mean, this position last year on average, if you included every single tight end in the NFL last year, so not just the starting guys, not just the fantasy guys, the combined points that teams allowed to them fantasy-wise was under 11 points per game. Like, it is a tough position. And we're seeing leagues respond by having like super tight ends, like 1.5 points per reception if you're a tight end and things like that. Or it's a tough spot. So to me, I don't have a lot of strong convictions outside the top elite guys for you just to say, you know what, I'm going to sit back and I'm just going to take Dawson Knox and bet on the touchdowns and bet on what we saw last year, because he was a demonstrably different player last year than he was before. There were tangible differences in his game, the confidence, the way that Josh Allen looked to him. Like, there were significant differences. I don't want my low ranking on him to be reflective that I think it was a fluke. I just kind of ran out of targets in this offense to go around. And I felt like if there was going to be a guy to lose a little bit off of his share, it's going to be Dawson Knox. And it's not like he's going to be a 100-target guy anyway. So that's kind of where I came in a little bit lower on him than maybe I would have liked.
Now, I want to get into these receivers, but you've said something there that provoked a thought when you're talking about distributing these targets. And every year I do my Bills stat projections, and so I know what that entails, right? It's a lot of balancing. It all has to add up. You have to really think about where the market share goes. But when I do think about this Bills offense and just kind of at a very basic level, what they had last year, what they have this year, Emmanuel Sanders, Cole Beasley, I think there's something like 160, 170 targets that are freed up from those two guys alone not being here. And you figure Gabriel Davis eats up a lot of that. You figure Jamison Crowder gets a lot of that. But from the remainder of what you have left to distribute from Sanders and Beasley's workload, it sounds to me like that's going more towards the running backs and more to the other receivers than you're thinking that it frees up opportunities for the tight ends.
Yeah, and I can even give you like a little bit of I looked at my target projections. Like I have right now Stefon Diggs. Again, in this case, for almost everybody, I'm assuming a fully healthy season, which again always changes the dynamic. Yeah. Guy misses 5 games, who's going to step up and all that. But I have Stefon Diggs at about 167 targets right now. I have Gabriel Davis pushing 100 targets on his own. I'm looking right here as I scroll down to find Crowder, and I have Isaiah McKenzie in that like mid 70s range, and Jamison Crowder a little over 80. So, and I also think that I also don't want to take away potential targets from Devin Singletary either. I still think he's going to be flirting with 40 targets. I have Cook I'm trying to see where I have him. Cook in that 50 plus target range as well. So, I feel like this offense is going to be pretty well distributed because I quite frankly like the offense as it's structured now, at least from a personnel standpoint, more than I like last year's team. Like I like the pieces that are on this team. And I know Cole Beasley has had a lot of success, but I really like Jamison Crowder. I really think he is one of the most underrated players. I think Gabe Davis has been ready to kind of bust out with increased opportunity. I expect a bounce back season a little bit from Stefon Diggs, even though he had a bad season last year. He just set the bar so freaking high after his first year in Buffalo. I like all of the pieces, and I like the depth that they have on this team. Like they're going 4 deep at wide receiver with starting caliber players. You have 2 running backs now that I feel are going to be more successful in the passing game. You have 2 tight ends. But it's to me just one of those scenarios where I think if this team is going to reach its peak, which again, there's one goal for the Buffalo Bills this year, it's win the Super Bowl. They're the best team in football. They're the favorite to win the Super Bowl. That's the goal. But to reach their peak, it's going to be spreading this ball out because they have so many ways they can beat you now. And then we haven't even talked about Josh Allen's legs. We haven't even talked about Devin Singletary as just a pure rusher. Like this team has so many ways they can beat you on offense that I think they're going to take whatever the path of least resistance is because you're just not going to be able to cover everybody. It's just not going to happen. And I think there's going to be a really interesting scenario where I think you're going to have some games that are going to have guys that there could be a Dawson Knox game where they're going to cover certain guys and he's going to get his, 4 for 57 and 2 touchdown type of a game. And there's going to be games where Jamison Crowder gets 14 targets. And you know what I mean? Like there's going to be some of those games that are mixed in, but to me, it's really exciting because from a Bills fan, even from a fantasy standpoint, like I think they're going to challenge to run the most plays in the league this year. I think they're going to be up around, north of 60. I think they're going to be in that 64, 65 offensive plays a game range this year. It's kind of where I have them projected. And this is not a team that takes their foot off the gas either. This is not a team that which is awesome for fantasy purposes. So to me, I could see some of these guys having a little bit more success even than what I have them projected to be, particularly if Stefon Diggs is more like a 140 target guy and you're trying to look, okay, well, now that frees up some more targets elsewhere. I'd be excited to have as many chunks of this Bills offense as I could get on my fantasy team, particularly in best ball, where you're looking at a scenario where you only are worried about their peaks and you're not even as worried about their valleys. It's an exciting fantasy team to talk about, which is significantly different than what we were talking about 5, 6, 7 years ago with this team. There are a lot of very draftable pieces from this Bills team right now.
Let's shift to the wide receiver position. And for this question, let's only talk about Stefon Diggs because I feel like you want to get to Davis and Crowder, and I do too. But let's give Stefon Diggs his due justice here. 103 catches, 1,200 yards, 10 touchdowns last year. Obviously, the bar was really, really high in 2020. What are you looking at from Diggs here in this season, and where does he slot among these wide receivers?
Yeah, so right now I have Diggs as I'm looking at it right now as my wide receiver 5. So he has not dropped very far from where he was before. And you look at, again, it's so weird to talk about last year as a down year. I mean, those are freaking good numbers. Like they really are. But he set such a high bar the season prior. I expect to bounce back. And actually the touchdowns were a nice surprise because he hasn't really been a guy that's been known for that was his first double-digit touchdown season of his career last year. But I expect him to be, back up to kind of that same little target range that he's been in. He was 166 targets in 16 games in his first year, up to 164 last year. If he plays a full season, I have him at 167, 168 right now. But I have him at, 113 catches, 1,350 yards, 9 or 10 touchdowns. Like I think he's going to kind of be somewhere in the middle of his first 2 seasons, which is good enough for me to play in the top 5. He still should get a pretty heavy target share, which I'm trying to see where I had him exactly. But his target share, I kind of used a mix of what he did in year 1, a mix of what he did in year 2, kind of weighted it towards last year to get to his current target numbers. I mean, I expect another big season from him. He has a very high floor. I can't really make an argument. There's some guys behind him that you like, but he's kind of a tier break for me. I've got Kupp and Debo and Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Stefon Diggs. That is my top 5, not in that order, but like that's the kind of combination. There's a tier break there for me that I think you were talking another step down to where you get to, the CeeDee Lambs of the world, or you're talking about the Mike Evans, or even the Tyreek Hills of the world, even the Devontae Adams. Like that is another tier down for me compared to where Stefon Diggs is right now, because that volume is so important. And if I make one point in fantasy that I think gets forgotten, is that volume matters as much as talent. And I keep trying to beat that home because it's sometimes difficult for people. They look at a player and go, yeah, but he's so good. Or, I don't really like him. But volume matters. Because at the end of the day, we're not putting together a real football team. We're putting together a team based pretty much solely on their stats. Who is in a position to get the work to put in it? And is Stefon Diggs the first or second best receiver in football talent-wise? No. But he's pretty darn good. And he's going to get a ton of volume. And I think that is where he separates himself from everybody else. Because right now I have him projected to get the 3rd most targets in the NFL. Behind only Cooper Kupp and DJ Moore. Like I really think he's going to get, and by the way, they're all kind of grouped together. That kind of talent with that kind of target workload in that kind of offense with that quarterback, I don't know what you would shy away from. He should definitely be among your top 5 wide receivers right now. And he's going as the 5th receiver right now off the board in early ADP. But he's receiver right now in early ADP. Him and Deebo Samuel are kind of going back and forth, but I'm taking him over Devontae Adams. I'm taking him over Tyreek Hill. I would take him a little bit earlier than you would get in most drafts.
I felt very seen when you were talking about the volume versus talent piece. So that was at me for sure. You seem really I'm very interested in your takes here on the rest of this Bills wide receiver room, because if I piece together some of the comments you've made already, you've got 70 plus targets for Jamison Crowder, Isaiah McKenzie, and Gabriel Davis. And I think you said you had Gabriel Davis around 100. So what thoughts do you have on the rest of this room? It feels crazy to me that many receivers could really be looking at that type of opportunity, but we're certainly talking about a Bills offense that's going to run a lot of plays. They're going to throw it a lot. They're going to throw it to receivers, and the makeup of this room is a lot different than it's been over the last several seasons.
It is, and particularly for the slot stuff, I don't expect a full season from Jamison Crowder. So I do think part of why Crowder and McKenzie are so close in target share that I think at this stage of his career, you got to kind of mark off 3 or 4 missed games for Crowder at this point, and it's easier to kind of get those targets up for Isaiah McKenzie. But, Gabriel Davis is a top 30 receiver for me. I'm really excited to see what he does. He's a guy that, again, is more, I don't have to explain to your audience, but more of a big play guy. Where he's not going to be so much with the volume. He's not going to have the highest catch percentage. I have him up around at 100 targets, but more around like that 55 catches, because he's just going to do more per reception than most receivers, but he's not going to necessarily his catch percentage isn't going to be of that elite variety. But touchdown machine, I mean, I can easily see him I have it projected for 10.5 touchdowns. Like I can easily see him getting a 10 to 12 touchdown range, which is going to be huge. I have him around 900 receiving yards. He's going to be a little bit more boom or bust, I think, where you have a guy like Stefon Diggs, who is the elite of the elite, is going to have that high floor for you. But I think that Gabriel Davis has that potential to win you your matchup by himself a few times this year in regular leagues. And obviously, if you have him in best ball, you don't have to worry about the valleys, because you're only going to get counted for the peaks. So he's somebody that I was really looking forward to. I really kind of started to like him last year, but kind of found himself, he had some inconsistencies. I guess it was 2 playoff runs ago. And then Emmanuel Sanders gets brought in and to kind of temper that expectations a little bit. This is his opportunity for him to really have a breakout year. And I would not be surprised if he's a guy that we're talking about as a must-start wide receiver 2 every single week by midseason. Those guys always kind of pop out. He has that profile. He's in the offense. I kind of want to see him be a little bit more consistent before I put him like as a top 20 wide receiver, but he's absolutely somebody I'm targeting right now as my wide receiver 28. And I really, really like his potential.
Coming out of that game against the Chiefs, right? Setting the playoff record for touchdowns, 4 of them over 200 receiving yards. Feels like that's carrying a lot of momentum. And then when you kind of look at his statistical production over his first 2 seasons, 35 catches both years, basically the same amount of yards, basically the same amount of touchdowns, but that market share is opening up in ways that it never has before. I wonder if the catch percentage goes up because there's going to be more volume targets as opposed to, I've made the case a lot that Gabriel Davis has been a beneficiary of how he's been used in the offense. Is kind of like the 4th or the 5th option. Josh Allen is able to extend plays. Gabriel Davis is good at the scramble drill, find him throwing the football. And, I think that resulted in kind of a catch percentage around 55%. I wonder if more consistent looks, right, as kind of like the number 2 on a lot of progressions, if we don't see that go up a little bit, but obviously a lot of hype here coming off of the playoff game.
And that's what becomes interesting is what happens with more volume. Like his average depth of target last year was over 13 yards down the field. Like, I mean, that, and it's understandable given his skill set and the skill sets of the other players around. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see with him and a few guys around the league that are kind of stepping into bigger roles now and going to get more volume. That almost always brings your average depth of target back down to earth because you're playing in a more significant role. There are going to be different plays designed for you. I think he can handle it. And I think that's a really good point where there's meat on the bone here. I think I've probably projected his touchdown peak. Like, I don't think he's going to be a 15 touchdown guy, but in terms of, his catches on the 55 catches on the 100-ish targets, the around 900 receiving yards, there's probably meat on the bone there for him to surpass that in this sort of a role. And if you are playing in a half PPR or PPR league, you want that. You want those opportunities. So I'll be very curious to see how he gets used this year now that he's going to be a fundamental piece of that offense.
Here's a fun stat for you. The Bills' record for receiving touchdowns in a single season is 11. That's the lowest in the NFL of any team. Really? Like their number for record touchdowns in a season, 11 by Bill Brooks, not Bucky, Bill Brooks in 1995. So according to Jamie, Gabriel Davis has a chance here to make a real run at tying this, if not making a new record. And even if, Diggs was at 10 touchdowns last year, I mean, kind of in striking distance, maybe we see a new single season receiving touchdowns record for the Bills next year.
It's crazy. I mean, he's caught a touchdown on more. I mean, again, it's limited targets, but Gabriel Davis has caught a touchdown on 10% of his targets.
It's crazy.
Like, that's nuts. Now, I think that's asking a lot for him to do again this year. And that's kind of where I said I'm at the peak of his potential touchdown production, but you never know.
Yeah. Josh Allen likes to throw touchdowns to Gabriel Davis. There's no question about that. Last thing for you here, and it feels weird to lump together kickers and defenses, but everybody kind of treats them differently when it comes to fantasy. The Bills have Tyler Bass, who's going to kick a ton of extra points. He's got a big leg, so that lends itself to a lot of big, long field goal opportunities. I'm guessing he's pretty highly ranked among the kickers. You certainly probably have more thoughts about that as well. And then the Bills last year, the number 1 defense in the NFL, a tougher slate of quarterbacks this year on the schedule. How are you looking at the Bills kicker and Tyler Bass and defense overall?
Yeah, so it was interesting because Tyler Bass was one of the top sought after kickers last year going into fantasy drafts because he was, believe he had finishing tied for 3rd with the most fantasy points back in 2020. Last year, there's some other kickers that kind of went past him. He was still top 10, but he kind of fell off a little bit in terms of fantasy ranking. But he's still somebody that I would be targeting. The reality is I'm taking kickers with the last pick of the draft. I mean, and I suggest that everybody else does that as well. There's just the week-to-week variance. Every number is proven that if you're streaming kickers, dropping guys, picking guys up, who's hot, who's getting a lot of red zone opportunities, what defense are they facing? Because you'll start to see there are certain defenses that are more bend but don't break. They allow a ton of yards, but they kind of stop teams inside. Their red zone percentage of touchdowns are actually fairly low, so those guys will kick more field goals on their team. Right now he's going as the 6th kicker off the board. I think that's about right. I mean, he's in that top 5 conversation, but I would be lying if I gave you any really strong opinions because from a fantasy standpoint, you're almost always better off picking up and dropping. Same thing with the Bills defense, but they are the top defense right now in fantasy drafts. And, they're the number one team there. Again, this is one of those ones where in fantasy, you're looking for ball production and sacks. Like that is what you're looking for the most. Trying to predict points allowed, it's tough, especially this time of year, because strength of schedule can be all over the place. And who we think are good now is not who's going to be good 8 months from now. But they're a team that should be in that top contention. You're looking for teams that are going to turn the ball over and get sacks. That is what you have a better chance of predicting going into the season. They're in that top 3 conversation for me right now as well, but I'm taking them in the second to last round. I mean, both of those positions, honestly, those are the last 2 picks you should make, a defense and a kicker, and you should be looking to stream every single week. Every analysis that's been done on this has proven that you're almost always better off doing that, and more often than not, the person that streams a kicker and streams a defense will actually accumulate more points over the course of a season than if you had the number one kicker or the number one defense on your team throughout the whole year. Like it's such a volatile positions. And also the difference isn't that high. Like I think people would be surprised to learn like the actual difference when you start to like map this out over the course of the year. Like last year, the difference between defense number 2 and defense number 13 was 2 points. And it seems like a lot, but like you're not playing those same guys every single year. And 2 points is not that big when you consider what the drop off would be from 2 to 10 at like the running back position. Or so people that are drafting these kickers and defenses in the middle round, you're missing out on potential, boom opportunities for whether it's a rookie, whether it's a potential breakout star, whether it's depth, whether it's a handcuff. I'm just not going to do it. So yes, if you could somehow tell me and beam me back from the future and say, this is going to be the number 1 defense in fantasy, sure, there would be some advantage of having that. But short of that, it's so unpredictable. I would rather just sit back and wait and see what I get and look and wait at the end of the draft and see who's got good week 1 and week 2 matchups. Let's not look too far ahead. Who's got a great week 1 matchup? Who's got a great week 2 matchup? Because I like the Bills. I don't love their week 1 matchup from a fantasy standpoint. Mm-hmm. They can win that game, but they're probably going to give up points while winning that game. So, but then also Stafford could throw it to you twice. So you never know. But it's just one of those ones where like to take the Bills in fantasy, you're going to have to give up too much. The opportunity cost for that is too great for me to target them. But you could probably get Bass at a pretty solid value unless you're playing in a league with a bunch of Bills fans.
Well, that's probably the case for a lot of people listening to this. Ladies and gentlemen, he's Jaime Eisner. Follow him on Twitter at Jaime Eisner and keep up with all the fantasy work that he does over at thedraftnetwork.com. There's a fantasy tab on the website where his projections and all the great information can be found. He's my guy for fantasy. He probably gets annoyed by the amount of should I do this trade text messages, but unless he signs off on it, I typically don't do it, even though there's one recently that I did that I haven't told you about. We can talk about that off air, but I appreciate you coming on here. Appreciate everyone for listening. That's going to do it for us here today on the podcast. I do kindly ask that you share, subscribe, rate, and review. Have a great rest of your day, and I look forward to catching up with you again tomorrow.